Hello, my name is Chard deNiord. I'm the Poet Laureate of Vermont, and this is Poet Speak, Conversations with the Vermont Poet Laureate. This month, my guest is Dede Cummings. Dede is a graduate from Middlebury College, where she was the recipient of the Mary Thwing Award and attended the Bread Loaf Writers Conference as an undergraduate waiter. Later, she studied with Hayden Carruth, and she may read a poem about Hayden Carruth a little later, in the summer session of the Bennington Writers Workshop. In 2013, she was a poetry contributor at the Bread Loaf Writers Conference. Her poetry has been published in Mademoiselle, The Lake, Inquirer, Vending Machine Press, Kentucky Review, Connotation Press, and Bloodroot Literary Magazine. She was a Discover the Nation Poetry semifinalist and the recipient of a writer's grant and a partial fellowship from the Vermont Studio Center. Dede lives in West Brattleboro, Vermont with her family, where she designs books and runs her own publishing imprints, DCD Design Books and Green Writers Press. It's wonderful to have you here today.
Thank you.
Dede.
I'm honored to be here.
And I was honored. It's a great honor to have you. You've been up to a whole lot in both your writing and in publishing, and I thought maybe we could begin with your new book, actually, which is To Look Out From, which just came out, I think, last month, right?
April.
Last
That's
April.
right. About a month ago.
Which has a nice little blurb by Billy Collins here, where he says, To Look Out From, Dede Cummings takes good advantage of the imaginative fluidity that poetry offers. Even her poems of memory and family are driven by curiosity and enlivened by quick maneuvers and sprightly turns, and she's careful never to leave the reader behind. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about the beginnings of this book, how it came to be, and its publication.
Oh, wow. This is a book that was begun in 1978, pretty much, when I was an undergraduate at Middlebury College. And I was in a poetry class. And I was so excited to be in a class with other poets, many of whom have gone on to do great things. Like Christopher Merrill was in my class, for example, and he heads up the Iowa International Writers Workshop. Very small group of 5, but I remember thinking, this is what I want to do, and I was so excited. I finished the 4 years and did a focus on poetry at Middlebury, but I was a literature major, which was quite rigorous at the time. I think it's really known for, Middlebury is known for that. So I began the book as an undergrad, and I had my first poem published in a national magazine when I was a senior, in Mademoiselle magazine. And back in the day, that was, it was very exciting, and I thought, wow, this is easy. I want to be a poet. But then life intervenes, but I always wrote. I kept writing and raised 3 children, and that took me away from my writing for a number of years. And then when my oldest went off to college, I had a little more time, and then by the time the youngest was in college, I really felt I was back into a routine of writing. So, I took a hiatus of probably 20 years.
Would you mind reading a poem or two? I've selected a few. You may have one in mind.
Sure.
I've marked Skyline Lodge here as a poem that might be wonderful to read.
That was an old one.
I love your poem Falling Grounds. Also St. Francis. And one that I know that you read a lot, which is Why I Love Obituaries. But you choose. I've marked some there for you.
Oh, wonderful. And, well, I would love to read something.
It would be wonderful to hear a poem of yours to start with here today.
Oh, that sounds great. Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Well, why don't I start with a poem that was written about my time in Middlebury College, where where poetry became so important to me. So this is a poem about a classmate who sadly ended his life. I feel poetry really has always been there for me as a way of expression, but as a way to also, as an outlet for me. So this poem, and this is my, one of my favorite poems, but it's simply called Skyline Lodge, for Alan Bouillet, 1957 to 1977. It was only then that I knew you, perched upon a tree stump, branches became your arms, your body fell in a suspended arc. I caught my breath holding you without a camera, before you landed with a light spring swept up in a powder drift. I laughed as you laughed. It was the first snow of the year. Our first footprints meant so much to us then, examined, measured for depth, like the tracks of deer minutes away. We cleared crusty snow from a possible pond. Between two mountains, we skated without blades. Ice gliding with your long legs, arms flapping as birds do, coasting the longest and the farthest, in the balance of a moment, which is memory on that slippery surface beneath us all.
Mm. Wonderful, wonderful. I'd love to hear one more, but I'd first like to ask you how you maintain your discipline as a writer, you know, doing all of the other things that you've been doing over the last 20 30 years. I mean, you said this book took, what, 20 or 30 years to write?
To finish and write, yes.
In the meantime, you've been publishing, you've been
designing.
You worked for Little Brown, you worked for David Godine.
Shambhala.
You worked for Shambhala.
Yeah.
And it makes sense that you ended up creating your own press, Greenwriters Press, which has been an enormously vital new press in Vermont, which I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about. But maybe one more poem before we do that.
Love to. So maybe a later poem. That poem was back to the Middlebury College days. So now we can go up to a poem that was written just a little over a year ago, and I went off to go to the Vermont Studio Center, and that gave me the space and the time. I was there for 3 weeks, and I was able to finish the book there. So this one is called Why I Love Obituaries. And my subtitle is, just for the audience here and for you, is pretty much verbatim from the Brattleboro Reformer obituary page. I'm really interested in found poetry, and just this is how I created this. Why I Love Obituaries. He was happiest watching the sunrise on a 5-degree January morning from a duck blind, listening to coyotes calling at sunset on a trout pond, standing in crashing surf, casting for stripers, or stacking the last cord of wood he had hand split for the season. He was happiest playing his fiddle, tapping his left foot at the Grange Hall dance floor, or tending raspberries, even selling them by the road, sweltering in overalls that had the grease of hands like stained permanent prints, the kind a child would wear. He was still doing chores, a handyman they called him, when he was found seemingly asleep in his bed. CL changed her name 5 times in her life. The third of 4 sisters, she became an actress at age 8, a dancer, model, a farmer, an artist, a photographer, mother, a teacher, a poet, a constant seeker. Never stopped exploring. She and her husband Henry bought a farm in Vermont, had 2 kids. He made cheese while she did Tai Chi. She was movement, passion, and laughter, saber, sword, and dagger, and wrote with a calligraphic hand. Mr. Bills, Jerry, worked 18 years at Brownsville Paper Mill upstate. He enjoyed camping and John Deere tractors. She loved nature, was always out of doors, dogs in tow, sometimes talking to them or even crying. She tapped 5 maple trees, hung her laundry outside on locust posts, composted like a zealot, and knit sweaters for her 3 children that still survive. She was happiest to live in a place with 4 seasons.
Oh, that's
Thank you.
wonderful.
Thank you.
Could you talk a little bit about how you transformed those obituaries into lines?
Yeah.
And how you decided, to include the information that you included.
Yeah, well, it's interesting you asked that question because when I studied with Hayden Carruth at Bennington, and he was a real mentor for me, and he was a wonderful Vermont poet and a character also, really, but he really said the axiom, write what you know and tell me a story about yourself. And when I worked with him, I had these poems that were just not my voice, And so one thing he really taught me was to write really, use your voice, your own voice. And that's what makes it really unique and hopefully universal. So one morning I was reading the Reformer. I love the paper. I love to go to the mailbox and get it and come back and have tea and read. And I was thinking, I always read the obituaries first. And partly it's a little morbid, like who do I know anyone who died? And on the other half of me is entranced by the stories of people's lives. And I was one morning reading the paper and I just was really struck. It was actually C.L., I think that's how you say the C.L. Tewksbury. Her obituary really made me pause and think about her life. She changed her name. She was a dancer. She was a really interesting woman. I didn't know her, but I felt like I knew her after I read it. So I just got inspired to take down the lists, because I think poetry is comprised of lists. A lot of poetry, going back to Dante's Inferno, lists of your surroundings, of the flora, of the fauna, of what you see in the world. So I just really, that issue is right there in the paper. So I just kind of wrote in pen and ink and took it down and tried to make it work into a series about the different people who had died that day. And I didn't want it to be a sad and depressing piece. And of course the last part, readers may guess, I'm a knitter and I knit 3 sweaters for my children, so I projected into my own almost elegiac, into the future. So my 3 children survive, I knit sweaters for them, and I was happiest in a place of 4 seasons, which that's a little bit of a hint to my concern for the global climate crisis, which comes through in my writing. This reverence for nature, and so I wanted to put myself in at the end of the poem, but I wanted to be sort of dead. I was dead poet. It's sad, but
you felt like you were there with the characters you were writing about.
Yeah, your life and what you make of it. And of course, being present in your life as a poet, I find that we can all get very, very busy, but for me, poetry is a way to the more contemplative life. And as an observer of the natural world and of the people and the animals and the nature that inhabits the natural world. I mean, that's my job.
Yeah. Now, one of your most ambitious poems in the book is a poem called, I think, Returning Home.
Yes. It's long.
About your daughter who was in an accident. And maybe the last poem you could read is maybe a section of that poem or part of that poem in which you attempt to deal with that trauma and come to terms with it as a very near death experience.
Yes.
But and to maybe just talk a little bit about how writing this poem helped you come to terms with that accident.
Excellent. I will read a section. The accident was very tough for my daughter and her cousin. So I, as a mom, I was in the caregiver role, and so once the girls were out of the intensive care and back, and I took 12 weeks off, and helped out down in New Haven at the hospital, and caring for my daughter was my job, and I did it with joy and utter selflessness, and I think that parents, whether you've adopted or whether you are grandparents or parents, you really do care for your children. So I just to fast forward after the accident, I'll read a second. Because it is really about the quotidian. I try to bring the ordinary into the poem and try to reach the universal that way, So I'll just fast forward up to the stanza that begins. My first act, being at my home in Vermont, the longest time I've ever been away, is to clean, vacuum, ready my space for what is to come. Nothing? Avoid? What meaning is beneath the surface? The smile from the sweaty cashier at the food co-op, saying as she thoughtlessly brushes a stray hair from her eyes, are the girls going to be okay? 2. My second act is to hike out the road we live on, late summer mirrored in green. The rich canopy sways in shadow, home to Vermont, my boat in a sea of green, startled when a great gray heron lifts in flight. During my daughter's rehab, I shielded my eyes from the glare of the Hudson. I ran there daily with the throngs of runners in packs. It helped me empty my brain, sweep away my daughter's pain, and out with the ebb and flow. Throb, baffled and curious brain, throw out questions and answers, suspend here and everywhere. So I'll just stop there, but the last lines are in italics, and they are referencing Walt Whitman. Ebb with the ebb tide, and from Leaves of Grass. Whitman was really someone I discovered after college, and as a poet, the act of writing this poem was really curative for me, and I want again to reiterate that it's a voice that I hope other people may respond to. So my voice, going through really unspeakable trauma as a parent to watch your child really struggle for life and have to kind of process that. I think poetry has always been a salve for me. It's been there for me since I was in my early teens, and a companion, if you will, for me, a way for me to communicate, but I've always wanted to share my work. And I know my daughter is just so supportive of my work, and it's just so joyful now to see her. I did a big book launch in New York City, and all 3 of my kids came.
Great.
So,
if you don't mind, talking about how she responded to the poem.
Oh, she loves my work. It's so
hearing your response to the trauma, did it give her a different perspective at all, or?
Oh yes. Well, she didn't really know what I was doing when I wasn't at the hospital, for example. Like there's a scene in there where I'm riding the subway and I'm holding a heavy book in my hand, and it's interesting because you when you are in a trauma or caring for someone who at the end of their life, you're enveloped in this world, and I think that the poetry seems to have reached a lot of people. I'm getting some wonderful feedback, and to me that's why I do this. I mean, I want to share the work, and if someone relates to it, if they're helped by it, that to me is just really, or if they laugh or cry or respond to my writing, then I feel that I've succeeded, and I don't need to sell hundreds of books. It's for me. It's just I have a book, and So it's
well, congratulations.
thank you.
This is your first book.
It is. I have working on a second book that's coming out in 2019.
Yeah.
So
And this was
exciting.
a contest, right?
Yes. A year ago, it's amazing, I didn't have a book, and I went to the Vermont Studio Center, and I just loved it there. And then I entered 5 contests. And I had a budget, because you have to pay to enter the contest. And so I spent $100, and I won one. And I was just so surprised.
And what was the name of this?
It's called the Homebound Publications
Publication.
Poetry Prize.
Right.
And I got an email from my publisher, she's so young, she's just terrific, down in Connecticut, and they had a lot of entries. And because I actually asked her, I was curious, but it didn't really matter. I won this prize, and that was very exciting. It's funny because I sent my manuscript to Billy Collins before I won the prize. Just because I'd met him very briefly in Woodstock at the Bookstock Festival.
Right.
And I wrote him just a fan email, and he responded.
That's amazing.
And I always tell aspiring writers, don't, all of these so-called, famous writers, and they've been in your place, they've been starting out, and I think it's nice to reach out to an author, a poet, especially one of Billy Collins's stature. But he's a mentor. He wants to help other poets, and so he wrote right back. And but then I told him, I thanked him for his blurb, and I said, oh, by the way, I won a poetry contest. And I sent him the link, and he read it. He wrote right back by email, and he said, congratulations. The next line was, the best $25 you ever spent. So I thought that was classic Billy Collins and very funny.
Well, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
I'd love to talk a little bit, too, about your publishing ventures. It's really an amazing story. As you said, you started out as a designer and as
at Little Brown in Boston.
Little Brown, and you worked for Shambhala, and you worked for Godin, not necessarily in this order.
Right.
And you weren't in Vermont the whole time. You were
in Boston.
Working in Boston for these other publishers.
Yeah.
But if you could just talk a little bit about what prompted you to move back to Vermont. Found a press that's doing remarkably well and is such an innovative, enlightened press called Green Writers Press, and is publishing just all sorts of wonderful writers around Vermont, from Leland Kinsey to David Buttbill,
and now
this new anthology, which you might want to hold up.
Looking at our newest, which literally came out May 12th, was our pub date, Roads Taken, Contemporary Vermont Poetry, edited by Chard deNiord and Sidney Lee, the former Vermont State Poet Laureate, and Chard being the current. So I was pretty excited to work on this beautiful book with artwork by local artist P.D. Mitchell, and filled with beautiful poetry from poets who are emerging poets and established poets. I mean, it goes back to Robert Frost.
Starts with Robert Frost, right.
Yeah. And Chard and Sid did an amazing job putting this together. And I just love it. I think it's going to be a great teaching tool for educators, especially people who really are interested in the language of place and how that is conveyed. And so it's an anthology that is really timeless, and the poetry is diverse and beautiful. Everyone in here has a Vermont connection, either lived here or born here, or has they have a home here, and it was a hard job for you to put it together.
It was, and I think Sid feels the same way, that we probably overlooked a few people that we still need to discover, but there are 86 poets in there, 300 pages.
That's a lot. We can do a second edition.
Okay.
I was thinking we'll do volume 2 and more poets. It seems that poetry is really so important to people, especially now, given our current political situation that our country is in. And if anything, poetry is more popular now than ever, because I think poems are really, they reach a universal, they have that power to transport the reader, but also to really comfort a reader. And I remember when my father was at the end of his life, he was in 2 wars, and he was a Navy officer, and he just wanted me to read Mary Oliver to him all the time. And it was interesting because getting back to starting out in the career, I was always writing poetry, but I designed poetry, and that was really I became known as a poetry designer. I currently work for Alice James Books, and I also work for Tupelo Press. And I do a lot of designing of poetry.
Covers and so forth.
Covers and interior designs. I'm very sensitive to the line breaks, and the poets seem to like that I'm a designer, but I'm also a poet. Yeah. And the first book I ever worked on at Mary Oliver at Little Brown was by Mary Oliver. Mm-hmm. And I didn't really know who she was back then, because it was 1986, and the book was called American Primitive. So I actually,
the Pulitzer Prize.
It did, and I had no idea, but I loved it, and I thought, this is really amazing. I went on to design other books, William Matthews, and I did a book by Ursula Le Guin of poetry, and, just a wonderful way to work, and I got paid for it, and I love the work. Yeah. So then 4 years ago, actually now it's almost 5 now, but I've been incorporated for 4 years. Green Writers Press was born in my studio. One day I just woke up and said, I can do this. I know how to publish, and I thought, this is a way that I can maybe raise the voices of the concern for the climate crisis, so that the focus of my publishing company in Vermont would be on the natural world and inhabiting that world, but also working as activists to try to preserve and conserve the natural resources. And Vermont's a great place to start. I feel like Vermont can really set an example for the rest of the country. So the Green Writers Press just took off. I think I hit a nerve, if you will, of people really searching for meaning in their lives, and trying to really save Mother Earth.
Could you just name some of the books you've done? I know there are dozens, I think.
Oh gosh, we have I think 45 titles.
That's unbelievable.
And we just signed Governor Madeline Kunin. We are going to be publishing her memoir, and that's exciting, in 2018.
Great.
It's called A Coming of Age to 80.
And you just published a book by Tim Weed.
Yes, Tim Weed is an emerging novelist, a fiction writer, and his book it's a collection of short stories. It's called A Field Guide to Murder and Fly Fishing. Right. And that's getting a great reception down in New York and all over the country. He's got big appearance scheduled for Denver, Colorado. That's kind of exciting.
And also David Buttbill and Leland Kinsey's posthumous books.
Howard Frank Moser, the late Howard Frank Moser, who was one of my favorite novelists. He was just a lion of Vermont literature. And when I started the press, there were some media, articles about green writers, and Howard sent me an email and he said, I want to be involved. And he said, I want you to publish Leland Kinsey. And I've got a poetry manuscript by him. I've been helping him with it, and it's ready to go. And I'm going to come down. And he said, I'm going to spend the night at the Latches Hotel, and I love to write there. It's a great place to write. Howard, this is the way he talked. He said, and I'll come over in the morning, and I'm going to pick you up, and we're going to go on a tour of the bookstores of Vermont in my beat-up old Dodge, sedan. So I said, okay, sounds great. So we toured southern Vermont. We got as far up as Middlebury, Vermont, the Vermont Bookshop, and we went all over together. And Howard was the head of my advisory board. right up until he died just this past January. So it was very sad. We miss him, but he is certainly living on through his own amazing books. But we established, he helped me before he died. We established the annual Howard Frank Moser Book Prize. It's going to be for an emerging novelist who lives in Vermont. Well, it doesn't really have to be in Vermont, but certainly the themes of place and writing about the natural world are really going to be a feature of the prize-winning book. And he selected the first winner. It's called The Lords of St. Thomas by Burlington's Jackson Ellis, and he's a young writer. He's got a little daughter now who's 3, and he like many Vermonters, he has a couple of jobs to pay the bills, and but he's a writer, and we're thrilled. The Lords of St. Thomas, that's coming out in 2018, and Howard wrote a blurb for it, and he got to see the cover before he died.
Oh, great.
So beautiful. Great. And then Leland Kinsey, who was just recently named the unofficial poet laureate of the Northeast Kingdom. I love that, because I'm sitting with the Vermont State Poet Laureate. But, you know, Leland really was a voice of the far north, of the kingdom, they call it.
I think some of the Montpelier legislature, someone recognized him.
Yes, they recognized him for his work as the unofficial work. He was just a delightful man to work with. I published now 3 of his collections, and the new one is coming out posthumously. It is called Last Correspondence, and he was working on that right up until his death at a young age. He was only 66 when he died, but he was very, it makes me as a publisher feel good that I was able to ease his journey into the end of his life, because he was very pleased that his book would be coming out. And same with David Budbill. He called me up and said, I want you to do 3 of my books. So I did. I signed a 3-book contract with him. So I'm working with his wife Lois Eby and their daughter Nadine Budbill, and they're amazing. And I just love David Budbill's work. I published a novel, it's kind of a young adult novel called Broken Wing, and that just came out a couple of months ago.
Right.
It's selling very, very well for us.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Also, just in the next few minutes, talk about some of the range of books that you've done. I mean, you've just mentioned these poets.
Right.
But you're and also the environmental mission that you are undertaking with this book, and the paper and so forth. But
well, our tagline, if you will, is Green Writers Press, giving voice to writers and artists who will make the world a better place. Now that's a very lofty goal, but all of our writers and authors who come to us and eventually publish with us have a very strong sense of community and are working toward the betterment of the earth and trying to stave off the crisis brought on by fossil fuels, and I think that we have to work even harder now, because our current administration is virtually ignoring all of the gains made by the previous administration, by the Obama administration, and rather than despairing and feeling just alarmed and not doing anything, our press is very focused on activism and working hard to make a difference, because you really, if you take the words of leaders like the Dalai Lama or Nelson Mandela, if you make a difference as an individual voice, then we will have, we hope, and we are seeing it, a chorus of voices that will join together. And writers have a very powerful tool, and artists we work with, because they really can use language to make that difference. And I really firmly believe this. And we also we're publishing from early childhood picture books to books that are science and, well, we were very interested in the field of science. As you know, we just recently had a science march in Washington. I mean, why do we have to have a science march? Because science is real. And, you know, I really want to support, we're not really going to be doing academic books, but we are very interested in memoir and, say, earth science combined. So one of our most successful books is called While Glaciers Slept, Being Human in the Time of Climate Change. And the author, a young 34-year-old scientist, she just passed her dissertation, and her PhD is in glaciology. Her name is M. Jackson. And she's very outspoken about climate change, and I really want to support her. She's given TED Talks. She was just named 10 days ago as National Geographic Explorer of the Year. She's among 14 worldwide explorers. So it's a huge honor, and we are her publisher, which is incredible. And she's just a dynamo. She's all over the world, and we're really proud of M. Jackson. And the book, it tells the story of her life, but it parallels her work as a glaciologist and in the field of the melting glaciers.
Yeah.
So, you know, from fiction and poetry
Dede,
to science.
It's amazing. I can't believe it's 45 books at this point.
And more.
Over
Yes.
30 years.
Yeah.
We're unfortunately running out of time, but would you read a poem just to close this?
Oh,
out
I
here?
would love
Of
to.
your choice, maybe.
I would love to.
Near the end. Whatever
yeah.
you'd like to read.
Well, there's one that you mentioned that I would love to read. It's about my neighborhood in Vermont. And I live in West Brattleboro up on the hill, on Bonnievale Hill. So this poem is called Falling Grounds. The ride down Bonnievale is always swift. The barns and horses at Meg's farm stare at the bike blur of me. Cows down by Dutton's snort as they lie down. The bike whizzes by, and I'm not really the rider at this early hour. By Irene's house, I see she has her laundry out. The two reddish squares, quilts hanging, are the equivalent of Tibetan prayer flags for me, as I note the date that my father would have turned 83. A cool snap is in the air. Put the bike down, fossil from another era, fuel from a zero-emission vehicle. Write what you know. Mr. Carruth's pipe hangs from his lower lip. Why don't you write me a poem that will prepare me for your death? So this is what I was thinking when I climbed the ladder to the topmost branch of our apple tree. The red bruises stare out at me. The tartness of the ripened fruit dries my mouth immediately. The picking is what is worth doing. The straw basket by my side is weighted down. The ache in my shoulder, a cause for celebration.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dede. It's been wonderful to have you on
Appreciate it.
Poets Speak, and I hope you'll come back.
Love it. Maybe for my second book. Thank you.
Thank you.